The fluorescent lights of Mercy General's ER hummed a frequency that most people never noticed. Megan O'Brien heard it the moment she pushed through the sliding doors at 2,247 hours, the sound cutting through the ambient noise of monitors and distant conversations like a tuning fork only apex predators could detect. She'd heard that same pitch in field hospitals in Sanjan Valley, Helmand Province, where the electricity ran on diesel generators and mortar rounds shook the canvas walls. Her body recognized the hum before her mind did, and muscle memory whispered warnings her civilian life was supposed to have forgotten. She moved through the ER corridors with the kind of measured calm that came from having already survived the worst. Nobody watching would have seen that. What they saw was a quiet night shift nurse in her mid-40s, dark hair pulled back in a practical bun, wearing navy scrubs that hung loose enough to hide what 13 years of healing silence could do to a body. Her name badge read, Megan O'Brien, RN. Just a nurse. That's what the badge said. That's what she needed everyone to believe. The smell hit her first, antiseptic and burnt coffee, that particular combination that existed nowhere else on Earth except ERS and military field stations. She was already reaching for the hand sanitizer dispenser when Nurse Jamie flagged her down near the trauma bay. Night shift census is light so far, Jamie said, checking her watch. 3 hours in and we've had exactly one sprained ankle and a guy who thinks he's having a heart attack but actually just drank 5 energy drinks. That'll change, Megan said. It wasn't a prediction. It was pattern recognition built from 4,847 trauma assessments across 3 continents. Jamie pulled up short. How do you always know? Radar, Megan said quietly, moving past her toward the staff room to clock in. The staff room was a tight rectangle of institutional grey with a microwave that smelled like someone's reheated fish dinner from 1987 and a refrigerator humming its own irregular frequency. Fluorescent strips cast everything in that exhausted white light that made people look like they were already half dead. Megan pulled open her locker, 382, third row, corner position where she could see the door, and hung her jacket on the single hook inside. Beneath her folded scrubs, precisely arranged in the front left corner, sat a pair of worn combat boots. They were Dana Tachyon tactical boots, leather darkened to the color of dried blood from 18 months of wear in mountainous terrain where ambient temperature hit 140 degrees and night temperatures dropped below freezing. The laces were still tied in military fashion, a quick-release knot that could be undone with 2 fingers. The left heel was scuffed where an IED blast had sent shrapnel through a Humvee door. The right boot had a small bloodstain on the toe, not her blood. She'd never gotten it out. She'd never tried. Those boots were the only physical object remaining from her former life. Everything else, the photos, the unit coins, the dress uniform with its 3 rows of ribbons, had been packed into a storage unit in Virginia Beach and left sealed since the day she resigned her commission. These boots had been in her locker for 2,847 consecutive shifts. Nobody knew they were there. Nobody could know. She touched the leather once, briefly, her fingertips moving across the laces in a pattern that was less a gesture and more muscle memory. 7 years of deployment, for combat tours, 847 combat surgeries. All of it lived in that single touch. Then she closed the locker door with a soft metallic click and stood motionless for 3 seconds, breathing through her nose, her shoulders dropping half an inch as the present day reasserted itself over the past. The scar on her left forearm itched the way it always did when she was transitioning into work mode. 3 inches long, ragged along the edges where the field surgeon had stitched it without anesthesia in a bunker being mortared with systematic precision. She pulled her long-sleeved undershirt down to cover it completely, then checked the cuff in the reflection of a darkened monitor screen. Hidden. Everything that mattered was hidden. When she emerged into the ER proper, the night had started its gradual metamorphosis from quiet to chaos. A woman with a twisted ankle was hobbling toward triage. An elderly man in a polo shirt was clutching his chest with the theatrical conviction of someone about to discover his symptoms were entirely stress-related. A paramedic was on the radio with incoming, 2-vehicle accident, Route 17, ETA 8 minutes. The symphony of an urban ER tuning its instruments. Megan moved to the medication station and began organizing the supplies with the precision of someone who understood that chaos was the failure to prepare for inevitability. For catheters sorted by gauge. Cardiac medications arranged in ascending order of potency. Intubation equipment checked and rechecked. Every tool exactly where it needed to be, arranged for speed and access. A 14-gauge angiocath in the trauma bay could mean the difference between a salvageable patient and a flatline. Dr. Hargrove arrived at 2,304 hours. She didn't look up from the chart she was reviewing, a GSW assessment from an earlier patient who'd been discharged, and whose file contained billing codes that didn't match the actual procedures performed, but she heard him before she saw him. His footsteps were different than the other physicians. Heavier. Deliberate. The kind of walking a man did when he was mentally cataloging real estate he already owned. When she did glance up, he was surveying the ER like a general surveying conquered territory. He was tall, early 50s, with the kind of tan that required either membership at a club or a commitment to looking important. His watch caught the fluorescent light, an Omega Seamaster, she noted, approximately $12,000 retail, and threw a brief flash of reflected brightness across the trauma bay. His tie was Italian silk. His shoes were hand-polished leather that had never touched a puddle. This was Dr. Marcus Hargrove, the new ER director. The man whose contract had been quietly circulated through hospital administration 2 weeks prior, along with word that he'd transformed patient outcomes at his previous 3 locations. The man whose previous 3 locations all happened to have billing departments that had attracted federal audits within 18 months of his arrival. Hargrove's eyes moved across the nursing staff and settled on Megan for approximately 2 seconds. What he saw was inconspicuous. A woman whose presence barely disturbed the air around her. A nurse who moved with practical efficiency but nothing that suggested anything beyond competence. Her scrubs were standard issue. Her hair was pragmatically restrained. She had no jewelry except a simple wedding band and a watch with a cracked crystal, the kind of accessory people wore without thinking about it, evidence of nothing except time passing. What he didn't see was the way her hands moved across the chart with the precision of a surgeon reviewing diagnostic imaging. What he didn't see was the notation system she was using, one that flagged billing codes as inconsistent with actual procedures by a ratio of approximately 34%. What he didn't see was that the quiet night shift nurse reviewing patient records at 2,307 hours had just identified the revenue stream keeping Dr. Hargrove's luxury watch wound tight. He moved past her without speaking. The incoming trauma diverted attention from charts and coding inconsistencies. The radio crackled, 2-vehicle collision, Route 17, northbound, approximately 4 kilometers from hospital arrival. Driver of first vehicle unresponsive. Passenger consciousness status uncertain. ETA 6 minutes. Megan moved to the trauma bay and began preparing without being asked. Trauma line set. Cardiac monitor positioned. The anesthesia cart moved to optimal angle for rapid intubation. Each movement was economical and certain, the muscle memory of someone who had prepared for casualties while actual casualties were still being manufactured 200 meters away by Taliban artillery. A trauma surgeon named Dr. Chen was already scrubbing in, moving with a focused intensity that meant he understood the window between life and preventable death was measured in minutes, sometimes seconds. He glanced at Megan once and gave her a slight nod. In 3 years of night shifts together, he'd learned that this particular nurse anticipated needs before they existed. He'd never asked why. Some things were better left unexamined. The ambulance arrived at 2,312 hours, its approach announced by the wail that cut through the Norfolk night like a blade finding the spaces between ribs. The patient was a 58-year-old male with steering wheel chest trauma, BP already dropping, respiration shallow and ineffective. His breathing sounded like someone learning to drown. The paramedic report came in clipped and professional, 43-year-old male, significant blunt force trauma to anterior chest, BP currently 94/62 and falling. We've got 2 large bore 4s running normal saline wide open, O2 sat currently 89%. They transferred him to the trauma bed in a single coordinated movement. Megan was already moving the defibrillator pads into position, already knowing before the chest X-ray what she'd see: hemopericardium. Blood filling the fibrous sac surrounding the heart. The pump drowning in its own container. The body's cruelest trap. A visiting combat medic was already moving toward the trauma bay. He'd been waiting in the adjacent area for observation of a previous patient, and he'd heard the alert code. His name badge read, Specialist Kyle Mercer, 75th Ranger Regiment Combat Medic. He was moving with the fluid precision of someone whose muscle memory included operating on wounded soldiers under mortar fire in Paktika Province. "We need hands," Dr. Chen said, not quite a request. Mercer was already gowned and positioned on the opposite side of the patient from Megan. The assessment took exactly 6 seconds, hemorrhagic shock secondary to cardiac tamponade. They needed to decompress the pericardium before the patient's heart simply stopped pumping blood. They needed a needle. They needed speed. They needed the exact angle and depth of a pericardiocentesis performed under conditions where a single millimeter of deviation meant penetrating the myocardium and converting a salvageable patient into a code. Megan had the 18-gauge needle already open and prepared. She'd already marked the patient's chest with her fingertips, locating the angle precisely, 5th intercostal space, just below the xiphoid process, at the optimal trajectory where fluid accumulated but vital structures remained precisely out of reach. She'd done this procedure 47 times in field conditions. She'd done it with a concussion. She'd done it while rounds were impacting masonry 2 meters away. Dr. Chen took the needle from her hand and advanced it with the kind of caution that meant he understood the margin of error was measured in millimeters. 15 millimeters in. The angle was wrong. He withdrew slightly, adjusted, advanced again. 20 millimeters. There, sudden return of dark blood into the syringe. The needle was in the pericardial space. The hemorrhage had stopped drowning the pump. The pressure on the monitor dropped immediately as the heart could expand again. The blood pressure stabilized. The oxygen saturation began climbing, 89, 92, 95, 97. Mercer was staring at Megan. Not at her face. At her hands. At the way her fingers had positioned the patient's chest with the precision of someone who had performed this exact procedure on wounded soldiers in locations where surgical conditions consisted of lantern light and the constant awareness that enemies were positioned on surrounding ridges. His eyes had narrowed in the specific way of someone whose pattern recognition was screaming a single message: "That's impossible. That precision doesn't exist in a civilian hospital nurse." Megan met his gaze for exactly 1 second. Then she gave him a single, small head shake. The kind of gesture that could mean nothing. The kind of message that meant everything. Mercer's expression shifted. He looked away. He continued assisting with the procedure, his movements returning to normal, his focus returning to the patient. But something in the air had changed. Some threshold had been crossed. Some secret had been nearly exposed and then pulled back from the edge like a soldier extracting a contact from a collapsing perimeter. The patient stabilized. His systolic pressure climbed to 102. His heart rate dropped from the panic rate of 142 down to a more sustainable 98. His oxygen saturation held steady at 97%. Dr. Chen was already calling the cardiothoracic unit. The patient would need immediate catheterization, probably open heart intervention, but he was no longer a code. He was no longer a man drowning in his own blood. He was a patient with a prognosis, which was to say he was a patient with hope. "Nice work, team," Dr. Chen said, and he nodded specifically at Megan. The kind of nod that meant something more than it appeared to mean on the surface. Mercer left the trauma bay and disappeared into the hallway. Megan didn't watch him go. She was already moving on to the next task, cleaning the resuscitation space with the methodical focus of someone whose training included operating in field conditions where contamination meant infection meant sepsis meant death. There were no shortcuts. There were only procedures. At 03 for 7 hours, she returned to her locker to retrieve something from the break room refrigerator, a container of leftover chicken that probably qualified as a biohazard but was technically still consumable, and she opened the door to locker 382. The boots were still there, still hidden beneath the folded scrubs, still tied in military fashion. Still waiting for a woman who'd left that life behind and never intended to pick it up again. But something had shifted in the ER tonight. Some boundary had moved. Some silence had been threatened. She'd looked into the eyes of a 75th Ranger Regiment combat medic and seen the recognition there, that singular moment where expertise meets impossible and the brain begins calculating whether ghosts were real. She closed the locker door and stood motionless for 3 seconds, listening to the fluorescent lights hum their frequency, the sound that existed nowhere except ERs and field hospitals and places where mortality was treated as a technical problem requiring a technical solution. The break room at Mercy General smelled like burnt coffee and the specific staleness of a space where people spent their breaks doing anything but resting. Dr. Hargrove stood near the refrigerator, wallet already in hand, his expression the kind of smile that didn't reach his eyes, the smile of a man used to having his jokes land because people were afraid not to laugh. "I'm starting a pool," he announced, his voice carrying across the room with the confidence of someone who had never been told no. 20 residents and nurses turned. Megan stood at the coffee station in the corner, her movements deliberate, mechanical. She was pouring coffee into a styrofoam cup that had been refilled so many times the rim was permanently stained brown. $20 says the mouse over there quits by Friday. He pointed. Not subtly. The finger aimed directly at Megan like a gun. She looks like she'd jump at her own shadow. Fresh from some civilian nursing home, I'd wager, not used to real medicine. Laughter rippled through the room, that particular laughter of exhausted residents who laughed because it was safer than disagreeing. Hargrove pulled a crisp 20 from his wallet, held it up like evidence of his confidence. Anyone? 3 residents stepped forward. $20 each. The bet was on. Megan kept pouring. One measured breath. The fluorescent lights above buzzed their constant frequency, a sound that existed nowhere else on Earth except ERs and field hospitals and places where mortality was treated as a technical problem requiring a technical solution. She did not look up. She did not acknowledge the laughter. She simply finished pouring, replaced the pot, and walked past Dr. Hargrove to the exit with a kind of composure that made his smile tighten almost imperceptibly because it was the composure of someone who had endured worse than his contempt, and that bothered him in ways he couldn't quite articulate. The next morning, she was still there. Day 2 arrived with the specific exhaustion that came from a 12-hour night shift at an urban trauma center. The cafeteria at Mercy General was bright in a way that made everything look slightly diseased, fluorescent light that converted all skin to a shade of gray-green that belonged in neither world. Megan sat alone at a corner table, a tray of pasta in front of her, a cup of water, an apple she wasn't going to eat. She chewed mechanically, her mind somewhere else, on the discrepancies she'd noticed in the supply room, on the cardiac catheter inventory that didn't match the actual usage logs, on the way certain procedures seemed to require twice the materials that the clinical protocols actually called for. Dr. Hargrove walked past her table during the lunch rush. Residents everywhere. Attendings. Nursing supervisors. The cafeteria was packed with a kind of crowd that noticed everything and said nothing. His hip caught the edge of her tray. Not accidentally, the trajectory was too precise, the timing too deliberate. The tray flipped. Pasta sauce splattered across white tile in a pattern that looked like spilled blood, noodles scattered like the aftermath of something violent. The room went silent. Everyone watched. Clumsy, he said to the watching crowd, his voice carrying the kind of satisfaction that came from successfully executing something he'd planned. He didn't even glance at her. He simply continued walking, his presence leaving a wake of uncomfortable silence. Megan knelt slowly. Her movements were measured, controlled. She picked up each piece of pasta, each scattered vegetable, wiped sauce from her scrubs with napkins that disintegrated in her hands. Around her, people pretended not to watch while watching everything. The shame was supposed to come now. The embarrassment. The desire to disappear. That was how this worked for people like Megan, people who looked like they could be broken by a public humiliation. But Megan had been hit harder by better men. She had been hit in places that didn't show. She had been hit by the kind of impact that made you understand that your body was just meat and bone and that both could fail. So she cleaned the floor, picked up her tray, and walked to the trash bin while Dr. Hargrove watched from across the cafeteria, his jaw tightening as she passed without acknowledging him, without the tears, without the broken posture he was clearly expecting. This was not the response he had paid for. Day 3 came like a verdict. Chart rounds. The nurses stationed during the morning briefing, residents clustered around computers, attending physicians reviewing overnight admissions. The energy was the particular exhaustion of people who hadn't slept in 18 hours and still had 6 more hours to survive. Megan stood with a patient chart in her hands, the GSW from last night, stable now, in the ICU, still alive because of work that had been done correctly. Dr. Hargrove stormed toward her like a man whose control was slipping and he was determined to reassert it through whatever means necessary. He didn't ask for the chart. He snatched it, and when she didn't release it fast enough, he hurled it at her feet. Papers scattered across the tile floor like snow. The room went dead silent. This wasn't the cafeteria anymore. This was public, professional, witnessed by everyone who mattered. "Pick that up, sweetheart," he snarled, his voice the kind of voice that made the air pressure change. Real nurses don't leave incomplete documentation. The residents froze. This was the moment where things went wrong, where someone might actually stand up, and everyone could feel it. Megan took one measured breath. A single tear escaped her left eye. It tracked down her cheek like it had somewhere to go, like it had a purpose. She didn't flinch. She didn't look away. She reached up and wiped it away with the back of her hand without breaking eye contact with him, her voice emerging like still water, like the kind of calm that came from having already survived the worst. "I've been hit harder by better men, Doctor." His jaw tightened. His hands clenched. For a moment, he looked like he wanted to hit her right there, right in front of everyone, but he didn't because he was a coward and cowards only hit people who couldn't hit back. He turned and walked away, his presence leaving a wake of stunned silence. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Megan knelt and picked up the scattered papers, restacking them with methodical precision. The chart was complete. Of course it was complete. She picked up every sheet, organized them by patient ID, arranged them in proper order. When she stood, she walked directly to his office and placed the chart on his desk without knocking, without speaking, with a kind of composure that made him understand, in that moment, that he had made a mistake. But he didn't know that yet. He didn't understand what he was actually looking at. That night, alone in the supply closet at 2 in the morning, Megan's hand shook as she inventoried gauze packs. Not from fear. From something else. Her trembling wasn't weakness. It was restraint. It was the physical manifestation of a woman who had learned that killing something required less energy than controlling your impulse to kill it. She noticed the discrepancies more clearly now. Cardiac catheter sets ordered at a rate that would require performing 847 procedures per month at a level 2 trauma center that realistically performed maybe 120. Advanced wound care supplies in quantities that exceeded any reasonable usage pattern. The numbers didn't match because they weren't supposed to match. They were being reported incorrectly, inflated, ordered at rates that would generate kickbacks for anyone positioned to receive them. And Dr. Hargrove was positioned exactly right for that kind of arrangement. She pulled one order sheet from the file. Dated 3 weeks ago. Signed by Dr. Hargrove. Quantities that were mathematically impossible. She photographed it with her phone and filed it away in the mental space where she kept dangerous information. The kind of information that could end careers. The kind of information that required extreme caution to deploy. What she didn't know was that this moment, this exact moment of discovery, was the moment Dr. Hargrove called his contact at MedSupply Solutions. The contact picked up on the second ring, his voice cautious, professional. "We need to expedite this," Hargrove said quietly, standing in his office with the door closed. "The new nurse is becoming a problem." The contact asked a clarifying question that Megan couldn't hear through the phone line 3 floors up. "No," Hargrove continued. "No, I don't think she knows yet. But she will know soon. Very soon. She notices things. That's the problem with people who actually give a damn about their work. They look too hard at everything. So we need to move the timeline up. I want her gone. Completely gone. By the end of the week if possible. The contract agreed. Protocols were discussed. A plan was formed at the institutional level, the kind of plan that required moving pieces very carefully, very precisely, so that when the collapse happened, it would look like her fault and not like the systematic dismantling of a threat to a seven-figure annual arrangement. What happened next didn't just silence the room. It shattered everything Megan thought she understood about who she was and what she could hide. At 4 in the morning, the ambulance bay doors burst open and a level 1 trauma came through like a thunderstorm. GSW to the chest, patient coding, blood everywhere, the kind of emergency that stripped away everything except the pure machinery of survival. The patient was brought directly to Trauma Bay 1. The attending called for a pericardiocentesis immediately, cardiac tamponade, blood filling the pericardial sac, the heart suffocating in its own cavity. This was the procedure. This was the moment that separated people who knew what they were doing from people who pretended. Dr. Hargrove called for a resident to perform the procedure. A young resident, competent enough, but not experienced enough for cardiac trauma. The resident's hands shook as he positioned the needle. Megan stood across the table, monitoring, and she watched the tremor in his movements, the hesitation, the calculation happening in his eyes. The patient's oxygen saturation dropped. 94, 88. 78, the clock was real. Muscle memory took over. She moved without thinking. Her hands crossed the table and repositioned the needle at exactly the right intercostal angle, the fourth space, just below the xiphoid process, guiding it precisely into the pericardial sac. Her voice changed in that moment. It dropped an octave, became crisp, became commanding, calling measurements in a clipped cadence that didn't match her usual quiet tone. Position. Angle. 45-degree cephalad. That's it. Now advance. Feel the give. There. Across the table, a visiting combat medic from the 75th Ranger Regiment, Staff Sergeant Torres, here for cross-training, froze mid-suture. His eyes widened. He knew that technique. That wasn't civilian training. That was forward surgical team protocol from Helmand Province. That was the kind of precision that came from performing procedures on bleeding soldiers under mortar fire, where hesitation meant someone died. Their eyes met over the patient's open chest. Recognition flickered across Torres's face like a light turning on in darkness. Megan gave the slightest head shake. Almost imperceptible. A signal that had been transmitted between military personnel for centuries. Keep quiet. This doesn't get spoken. Torres paused for 3 long seconds. Then he nodded once and continued suturing in silence. The needle found the pericardial sac. Blood drained. Red fluid filled the syringe. The pressure released. The heart resumed its rhythm. The patient stabilized. O2 sac climbed. 82, 88. 94, sinus rhythm returned like an echo of life choosing to continue. As they stripped gloves, Torres moved close to her, his voice pitched low, meant for no one else. Nice work, Chief. Megan stiffened but said nothing. The word hung in the air between them. Chief. Not nurse. Not sweetheart. Chief. Meanwhile, Dr. Hargrove stood in the observation window, watching the entire procedure, and his expression was darker than before because now he understood the actual scope of the threat standing across from him. She wasn't just competent. She was something else. Something trained. Something dangerous. And she was asking the right questions about inventory and procedures and protocols. She was the kind of person who would eventually piece together what he had built, and when she did, his entire arrangement would collapse like a house constructed from nothing but air and fraud. He made the call that afternoon. The elevator doors hissed open on the 3rd floor of Mercy General, and Megan stepped into the sterile corridor with a fresh bag of saline and the kind of exhaustion that had become her normal. 2 days had passed since the shooting. 48 hours of pretending she wasn't moving at half speed, that the bullet wound in her left shoulder didn't pulse with a dull, insistent throb every time she lifted her arm past a certain angle. The bandage beneath her scrubs was smaller now, the bleeding mostly stopped, but the pain was information, a reminder that she'd stepped in front of a gun and the world hadn't ended. She'd survived worse. Much worse. The post-op ward was quiet, fluorescent lights casting that particular hospital glow that made everything look vaguely surgical. Room 312 was at the end of the hall, the secure observation room where Mercy General kept patients who needed protection from the outside world. Sergeant First Class Marcus Webb had been transferred from a federal facility that morning, a Green Beret recovering from wounds he'd taken during a federal courthouse testimony against a drug ring operating out of the port of Norfolk. The same cartel that had tried to silence him by sending a shooter into the emergency room. The same shooter she'd taken a bullet deflecting. Megan checked the chart outside his door. Vitals stable. Post-op day 2. Orders from Dr. Hargrove, minimal disturbance, observation only, nursing care by rotation. Which meant she wasn't supposed to be here. Her shoulder screamed in protest as she pushed the door open anyway. Marcus Webb was awake, propped up on pillows, his right leg elevated and immobilized from a femoral wound repair. He was the kind of soldier who looked dangerous even lying flat in a hospital bed, the kind whose eyes tracked movement with the precision of someone trained to process threats in milliseconds. Those eyes found her the instant she entered. Recognition flickered across his face like a match striking in darkness, then something deeper. Something that made her breath catch in her throat. "Good morning, Sergeant," she said, keeping her voice level, professional. The voice of a nurse, not a senior chief petty officer. Not someone who had once held his squad together while mortars screamed overhead. "How's your pain level?" 7 out of 10. Manageable. He watched her move toward the forestand, noting how she favored her left side. "You're hurt." "Just doing my job," she said, and adjusted the saline bag with her right hand, keeping the left arm still. The fluorescent lights hummed their constant electrical drone above them, a sound that had become the soundtrack to her hidden life. "You were the one in the ER." He wasn't asking. "During the shooting." Megan's hand stilled on the tubing. She didn't look at him. "I was there, yes." "You took a round." His voice dropped, became something like a command. "For me." The hospital corridor outside fell away. There was only the steady beep of his heart monitor, the soft wheeze of the oxygen running through his nasal cannula, and the weight of recognition between them. She could lie. She could deflect. She could maintain the wall she'd built so carefully over these past 5 years. Instead, she checked his dressing with a clinical eye. The bandage was clean, no signs of infection, the wound edges properly approximated. Her hands were steady. They always were. "Your surgeon did good work. Full thickness closure on the femoral repair. You'll have mobility back within 6 weeks if you follow protocol." "Helmand Province," he said quietly. 5 years ago. Sanjin Valley. Rocket attack on our convoy. 3 of my men went down, and you. That was a long time ago." Her voice had gone flat, still water calm. The voice of someone who had learned to bury things so deep they stopped echoing. "No, it wasn't." He shifted his weight, winced, held steady. "You operated on Patterson. On Rodriguez. On me. We were a mess, and you held us together. I remembered your hands, precise, never shaking, like you were working on someone's favorite watch instead of someone's insides. And then you disappeared. We heard you rotated out, but nobody knew where. Story was you just vanished." Megan finished checking the 4-line and turned to leave. Her shoulder screamed. She didn't let it show. "Wait." Webb's voice carried the weight of command, and her body responded before her mind could stop it. She stopped at the door. "What's your name?" "Your real name, not the one on the badge." She turned back to face him, and for just a moment, just one small, fractional moment, he saw something else move behind her eyes. Something that looked like armor dropping for a split second before it snapped back into place. Megan. Megan O'Brien. Webb nodded slowly, like a piece of a puzzle had finally clicked into place. That's not what they called you. She left before he could say it. Before her careful world could collapse entirely under the weight of a name she hadn't heard spoken aloud in 5 years. Her shoulder throbbed in rhythm with her heartbeat as she moved down the hallway, and she told herself that this was temporary. This was nothing. She would finish her shift, go home, and tomorrow this would be just another complication to manage. But that wasn't what happened. That afternoon, Dr. Hargrove pulled her into his office with a hospital board member present, a man named Sterling with the kind of tan that came from winter golf in Florida and the kind of smile that didn't reach his eyes. The board member received consulting fees from the same supply company Hargrove was quietly padding bills to. A silent partnership built on mutual interest and the understanding that no one would ever know. "We've had complaints about your attitude," Hargrove said smoothly, settling back in his leather chair. His voice was reasonable, clinical, the voice of a man documenting a problem for official record. "Your judgment during emergencies. Your tendency to overstep protocol." Megan stood in the center of the room, not invited to sit. "I'm not aware of any complaints." "Exactly the attitude I'm referring to." Hargrove opened a folder on his desk, official-looking, typed, with her name across the top. She'd seen fabricated medical documents before. This one was good. "We have a formal review initiated. Hospital policy requires a 30-day observation period followed by a competency evaluation." "On what basis?" "Protocol violations. Insubordination. Questionable decision-making during high-stress situations." He wasn't looking at her now, just reading from the carefully prepared narrative. "This is pending investigation, of course. We're bringing in an outside consultant to assess your fitness for duty." Sterling cleared his throat. "It's standard procedure, Ms. O'Brien. Nothing personal." Everything in Megan's body wanted to speak. To tell them exactly what she'd seen in those supply invoices, the phantom orders, the billing codes that made no medical sense, the pattern of fraud so obvious that anyone who looked at the records for more than 30 seconds would see it. But speaking meant revealing how closely she'd been watching. Speaking meant they'd know she was a threat, and threats had a way of disappearing in systems like this. "I understand," she said instead, and her voice came out flat and deferential. The voice of a nurse who had accepted her place in the hierarchy. "When does the review begin?" "Monday. You'll be on a temporary schedule while the investigation proceeds. Different floor assignments. We're rotating you to day shift." Hargrove's eyes finally met hers, and she saw satisfaction there, the kind of satisfaction that came from having moved a chess piece into place. "That should give you some time to reflect on your conduct." "Dismissed." She left his office and walked straight to the break room, where she sat in a plastic chair and drank 3 cups of bad coffee with her eyes fixed on the wall. Her shoulder throbbed. Her mind moved through the implications with the precision of a tactical assessment. He'd called her references. She knew this because she'd gotten a voicemail from the VA clinic where she'd worked before Mercy General, a confused message from an HR coordinator saying someone had called asking about her mental health history, her stability, her reliability under stress. He'd been planting seeds. Building a file. Creating the narrative that would make her termination look like a necessary action rather than an act of desperation. And it was working. By evening, security logs showed a visitor attempting to access the secure wing where Webb was recovering. Security turned him away before he got anywhere near the elevators, a man in civilian clothes, asking for the room number of a federal witness, the kind of careless approach that suggested either desperation or a test run. Hargrove personally reassigned Megan to the pediatric floor for the night shift, citing workload distribution and the rotation schedule he'd just fabricated. Put a less experienced nurse, one of his allies, on Webb's case instead. When shift change came at 11 p.m., Megan walked past the pediatric ward and up to 3rd floor post-op. She pulled Webb's chart from the nursing station. The new nurse's notes were sparse, almost negligible. Vitals checked at intake and once at 8 p.m. No medication administration records. No assessment of pain or wound drainage. No observation of the foresight for signs of infection or infiltration. Nothing that suggested anyone was actually monitoring the man who'd nearly died 2 days ago and needed secure observation because there were people out there who wanted him dead. She went to his room on her break, moving through the hospital the way she'd learned to move through fire zones, present but not present, part of the landscape, noticed by no one because she'd become invisible. Webb was asleep when she entered, his face in profile against the white pillow, the machines around him creating their steady mechanical symphony. Beep, wheeze, hiss. The soundtrack of recovery. Megan checked his full line, confirmed there was no infiltration, assessed the post-op dressing on his femoral wound. Everything was stable, but just barely. Left alone much longer, complications would start to set in. The kind that required emergency intervention. The kind that looked like bad luck instead of negligence. She was adjusting his oxygen flow when Webb's eyes opened. "You came back," he said quietly. "You're not being properly monitored." She kept her voice low, clinical. "The nurse assigned to you missed medication administration. Your dressing needs to be changed in 6 hours. Because I'm a threat." He wasn't looking at her now, looking at the ceiling instead. "Hargrove wants you away from me. Wants me in the hands of someone who won't notice if something goes wrong. That's not Valkyrie." He said it like a password. Like the name of someone who had died and been resurrected. "Your call sign. That's what they called you in Helmand. Because you dropped out of the sky and saved lives. Because you were deaf to anyone who threatened your people." Her hand stilled on the four tubing. The fluorescent lights hummed around them, indifferent to the weight of memory in the room. She should leave. She should walk out and never come back and let the system do what it did. But her hands didn't move. "That was a different person," she said quietly. "That version of me doesn't exist anymore." "Then why are you still fighting?" Webb turned his head to look at her. "Because from where I'm lying, she's still here. Still protecting people. Still putting herself between the danger and the innocent." An alert siren wailed in the parking garage below, an ambulance arriving, emergency lights painting the night in alternating red and blue. The sound cut through the moment like a scalpel, and Megan pulled her hands away from the fall line. "Get some rest, Sergeant," she said. "I'll make sure someone checks on you." She left before he could respond, before the wall could crack any further, before the name Valkyrie could fully crack the surface of the identity she'd buried so carefully. But as she walked down the corridor away from his room, she understood something with a kind of absolute clarity that only combat had ever given her. The past wasn't something you could run from anymore. The past had just admitted itself to Mercy General, and it was about to blow everything open. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed their constant electronic prayer when the ER doors burst open at 11:56 p.m. A man in a charcoal jacket rushed through, weapon raised, eye scanning the trauma bays with the focused intensity of someone on a mission that had consumed him for 3 days straight. His voice cracked like a whip. "Marcus Webb." "Where is Marcus Webb?" Security didn't move fast enough. Nobody expected violence during the quiet hours, the lull between midnight chaos and dawn emergencies. The shooter pushed deeper into the unit, past the registration desk, past the supply closet. Staff scattered like birds from a sudden sound. A resident froze. A nurse dropped her clipboard. The metal clattered against tile, hollow and accusatory in the silence. Megan was in Bay 4, checking Webb's post-operative vitals on the monitors. His shoulder surgery had gone clean, the bullet removed, the tissue repaired, the kind of precise reconstruction that came from experience with trauma that most surgeons only read about in journals. She'd been standing there for maybe 30 seconds, watching his oxygen saturation climb steadily, when she heard the shouting. Heard the panic in the hallway. Heard the distinctive sound that every combat veteran recognizes instantly, whether they want to or not, the mechanical slide of a weapon being chambered. Her body didn't ask permission. Her hands didn't consult her civilian mind. The shooter rounded the corner into Bay 4, weapon raised, muzzle aimed at Webb's bed. Webb was awake, his eyes widening, his body still too weak to move. Megan saw the barrel rise. She saw the man's finger tighten on the trigger. She saw the 3-meter distance between the weapon and the soldier. All of it processed in the part of her brain that had been trained at forward operating base Leatherneck to make decisions in microseconds. The part that had saved 14 lives in a single night during the October rocket attacks. The part she'd spent for years trying to bury. She moved. Not with hesitation. Not with the careful deliberation of a civilian nurse. She threw herself across Webb's bed, her body a barrier, and in that same moment, the same terrible, crystalline moment, the shot fired. The sound was like a door slamming in a confined space. Wrong. Too loud. Her left shoulder exploded. Not burned. Not ached. Exploded. The bullet punched through muscle and bone and exited in a spray of red that painted Webb's white sheets crimson. She felt it before she understood it. Felt the shock wave traveling through her nervous system like lightning finding ground. Megan hit the floor hard on her right side, and the pain that followed wasn't dramatic, it was absolute. It screamed through her shoulder, down her arm, up into her neck. She opened her mouth and sound came out, real sound, the kind of agony that couldn't be controlled or managed or compartmentalized. Her hands shook as they moved to her shoulder, applying pressure, her right palm pressing against the wound as blood poured between her fingers like water from a broken tap. Her vision swam. The ceiling tilted. Shock was pulling at her, trying to drag her under into the dark place where things didn't hurt. But something older than shock took over. Lockdown protocols now. Her voice cut through the screaming like a blade. Security had tackled the shooter by then, 2 officers driving him face-first into the wall, but Megan was still barking orders, her voice steady even as her hand trembled with blood loss. Secure the entrance. ER is closed. Nobody in or out. Someone call SWAT, they're for minutes out. She didn't know that. She had no way of knowing that. It was just the first number that came, the way her brain still worked in triage calculations even as pain tried to steal her consciousness. Get a level 1 rapid infuser ready. I'm type O 14-gauge angiocath, run the blood at full pressure. She was giving orders about herself. Speaking about her own wound in the third person, the way she'd been trained to do when there was no separation between patient and operator. Webb tried to move toward her, tried to stand on his surgical leg despite the catheter in his arm, but his body betrayed him and he collapsed back onto the bed, calling her name like she was already gone. The EMTs came. 4 of them moving with the practiced economy of people who'd seen everything. They loaded her onto a stretcher with the kind of careful urgency reserved for staff injuries. Nobody wanted to move a colleague roughly, but everyone wanted to move fast. One of them pressed his hand against her shoulder as they wheeled her toward the ambulance bay. Pressure dressing going on. You're going to be okay, Meg. You're going to be fine. She almost believed him. Almost let herself drift under the warmth of the pain medication they pushed through her for. The ceiling of the ambulance blurred. The sirens wailed. The world became distant and soft and mercifully unreal. 48 hours later, she was still bandaged and wrapped in gauze, still floating on pain medication that made her thoughts feel like they were moving through water. The bullet had shattered the scapula and nicked the supraspinatus, but missed the brachial artery by 2 centimeters. 2 centimeters between recovery and hemorrhagic death. The surgeon who'd repaired her had been clinical about it. Lucky. That was the word he used. Lucky. Like survival was chance instead of intent, instead of the fact that she'd thrown her body in front of another person's and meant it. She was summoned to the HR office on the morning of day 3. Still on pain medication. Still moving slowly. Still bleeding through the bandages when she moved wrong. A woman in a slate-gray suit with a sympathetic smile sat across from her. And beside the woman sat Dr. Hargrove, his expression carefully neutral, his fingers steepled on the desk like a man who had already won something. Megan, we're so glad you're recovering, the woman began. Your bravery was extraordinary. But we need to discuss the circumstances surrounding the incident. Hargrove slid a single-page document across the desk. Termination letter. Already printed. Already signed by someone. Already notarized by his network of allies. You accessed a patient you weren't assigned to, Hargrove said, his voice smooth as oil. Mr. Webb was under my direct supervision. Protocol is clear, floor nurses don't enter other physicians' bays without authorization. His eyes were cold. Satisfied. He'd been waiting for this moment since she'd first flagged the discrepancies in his supply billing 3 weeks ago. Additionally, your actions placed other staff members in danger. You created a situation of heightened risk through reckless protocol deviation. Megan opened her mouth to explain. To tell him that she'd been checking vitals, that Webb's room was only 2 bays from her station, that her response had been instinctive, that she'd seen a weapon and a defenseless patient and had made the only choice that made sense. But the words tangled. The pain medication made her thoughts sluggish. And more than that, she couldn't explain the real reason she'd moved that way. Couldn't tell him that her body had remembered things her mind had spent for years trying to forget. Couldn't say that muscle memory doesn't vanish just because you want it to, that training runs deeper than civilian life, that some instincts don't care about your carefully constructed anonymity. We've also been contacted by previous employers about concerns regarding your mental health, Hargrove continued, sliding a second document across the desk. It was a summary from the clinic she'd worked at in San Francisco before Mercy General. The clinic where she'd been treated for PTSD. The clinic that had assured her that medical records were confidential. The nature of your reaction to the shooting incident raises questions about your stability and judgment. We've brought in an outside investigator, and he's recommended immediate termination. The investigator. Hargrove had worked fast. She'd been in surgery for 3 hours. Sedated for another 12. By the time she'd woken up, he'd already made calls, activated his network, contacted the people he'd carefully cultivated relationships with over his first month at Mercy General. The hospital board members who owed him favors. The outside consultants who rubber-stamped conclusions they were paid to reach. He'd built his case before she could even stand up. Her hand shook as she signed the termination papers. The pain medication made everything feel distant and unreal, like she was watching someone else sign away her job, her salary, her carefully constructed life of anonymity. She couldn't fight back without revealing the very thing she'd run here to hide. Without telling them that the reason she'd thrown herself in front of Webb wasn't recklessness, it was training. It was muscle memory from a decade of operating under fire, from watching soldiers die, from learning that your own body's preservation instinct is the first casualty in a war zone. She walked out of Mercy General at 2:15 p.m., carrying a cardboard box containing her personal items. A ceramic mug with a crack running down one side, a gift from her sister 7 years ago. A succulent that was probably already dead. A photograph, faded at the edges, of 8 people in desert camouflage standing in front of a 7-ton truck in Helmand Province. The names of the 3 who hadn't come home were written on the back in her handwriting. The bus stop was 6 blocks away. Megan sat on the metal bench, rain soaking through her jacket, the cardboard box growing soft in her lap. The bullet wound in her shoulder throbbed in time with her heartbeat, a dull, persistent ache that pain medication could only dull, not eliminate. A woman walked past, glanced at her, looked away quickly. Nobody saw a Navy veteran who'd saved lives under mortar fire. They just saw someone sitting at a bus stop in the rain, holding a box of belongings, looking like she'd lost everything. She had. And she was about to find out what that meant. The cardboard box sat unopened on her sister's kitchen table, the single plant inside already browning at the edges. Megan stared at it from the couch, her left shoulder wrapped in surgical gauze, the dull ache of morphine making everything feel distant and unreal. 48 hours. That's how long it took for Dr. Hargrove to dismantle everything. The bullet wound throbbed with each breath, a rhythm like a clock counting down something she couldn't name. Her phone rang at 3:48 p.m. on a Tuesday. It wasn't the hospital administrator. It was a voice she didn't recognize, calm and measured like someone used to giving orders that didn't require discussion. Senior Chief O'Brien? This is Jake Morrison, Marine Corps. I work IT at Mercy General. We need to talk about what Hargrove did. Megan sat up, the movement sending a spike of pain across her collarbone. She said nothing. Silence was safer. I found something. Security footage from the parking garage, the cafeteria, the break room. All of it. Hargrove tried to get me to delete the files yesterday morning. Said they were redundant records. I'm a Marine. We don't destroy evidence. Morrison paused. I've also been looking at the billing discrepancies you flagged before the shooting. The ones Hargrove said were clerical errors. The silence stretched between them like a held breath. They weren't errors. 340% inflation on cardiac supply orders. Payments to a company called MedSupply Solutions that doesn't match any actual inventory. I've got receipts, bank transfers, everything. I contacted the FBI this morning. They're very interested in talking to Dr. Hargrove. Another pause. The hospital board needs to see this. All of it. Will you come in tomorrow? Megan closed her eyes. The worn combat boots were still in her locker at Mercy General, hidden beneath civilian scrubs that no longer felt like camouflage. They felt like a lie she'd been telling herself for 8 years. I'll be there, she said, and hung up. The hospital board conference room smelled of coffee and furniture polish, the kind of sterile corporate atmosphere that made Megan's skin crawl. She sat at the far end of the mahogany table, her left arm in a sling, bandaging visible beneath a loose-fitting scrub top. 7 board members. 2 hospital attorneys. And Jake Morrison, who carried a laptop like a weapon and wore the kind of stillness that marked him as military before he ever said a word. Hargrove stood near the window, confident, his expensive watch catching the light. He hadn't expected this meeting. He'd expected Megan to stay broken, to stay quiet, to stay erased. Jake opened the laptop without preamble. The first video filled the screen, Mercy General's break room. Hargrove at a folding table with 5 surgeons, laying down bills. $50 says the new night nurse quits within a week. Any takers? Laughter. One surgeon doubled down. I'll take that action. She looks soft. The board members exchanged glances. Jake advanced the footage. Cafeteria. Megan carrying a tray. Hargrove walking directly toward her, his shoulder connecting with hers. The tray fell. Food scattered across tile like a crime scene. Megan bent to pick it up. Hargrove stepped over her without breaking stride. No one moved. The next clip, her chart sailing through the air, hitting Megan's feet. Hargrove's voice, clear and sharp, "Pick that up, sweetheart. Your paperwork's as messy as your work ethic." Jake closed the laptop. That's 4 minutes of footage from the past 2 weeks. Every incident. Every humiliation. Every calculated act designed to force her resignation so she couldn't report the billing irregularities she discovered. He opened a second file. Banking records filled the screen now. Numbers with too many zeros. Cardiac supply orders, Jake said, his voice steady as a metronome. Placed by Dr. Hargrove. Signed off by Dr. Hargrove. Paid to MedSupply Solutions, a company that exists only on paper. The actual supplies cost Mercy General $34,000. Hargrove's orders cost $115,600. The difference went to a bank account in the British Virgin Islands. 8 months. $180,000. Jake pulled up another document. Senior Chief O'Brien flagged these discrepancies on her medical chart reviews. She had no idea what she was looking at. She was just doing her job. Hargrove realized she was a threat to his operation. Hargrove's face had gone the color of old bone. The FBI has been investigating MedSupply Solutions for 3 months, Jake continued. They needed proof of the connection. You just gave it to them. He looked at the hospital administrator, a woman named Patricia Chen whose hands trembled slightly as she reached for her phone. I've already sent copies to the FBI field office in Richmond. They're about 20 minutes out. Hargrove moved toward the door. Security was already waiting on the other side, two men with a kind of casual strength that said they'd done this before. He didn't struggle. He simply walked out, his expensive watch glinting under fluorescent lights that suddenly felt very bright. The conference room stayed silent for exactly 3 seconds. Then Patricia Chen stood up. "Reinstatement, full back pay, and a formal written apology from this hospital," she said, looking at Megan. "We're also creating a new position. Head trauma nurse. Combat-informed protocols. Your expertise, your rules." She paused. "That is, if you want it." Megan held the older woman's gaze. 8 years of hiding. 8 years of pushing down everything she'd learned in Helmand Province, everything she'd earned, everything she was. One measured breath. "I want it," she said. The FBI arrived at 4:23 p.m. 3 agents in dark suits, professional and efficient. They took Dr. Hargrove out in handcuffs, the rattle of steel against his wrists the only sound in the corridor. Staff turned to watch. Some of them had laughed at Hargrove's jokes. Some of them had participated in the betting pool. All of them had watched him push Megan's tray to the floor and said nothing. Now they looked at her with the kind of recognition that felt like seeing a ghost suddenly become solid again. Megan was already leaving when the Navy SEAL liaison arrived, a commander named Davies, square-shouldered and precise, there to check on Sergeant First Class Marcus Webb's recovery. But he stopped mid-stride when he heard the name Senior Chief O'Brien, when he realized who had taken a bullet meant for Webb. He found Megan at her locker, the worn combat boots in her hands. "You ran surgical ops in Sanjin Valley," he said. It wasn't a question. She looked up. Didn't try to deny it. 3 tours. Senior Chief Petty Officer. You pulled 17 Marines through surgeries in a forward operating base with mortar fire hitting the roof. Davies stepped closer, his voice dropping. You saved more lives than most trauma surgeons see in a decade. The Pentagon has records. The Navy has records. Sergeant Webb recognized you the moment you walked into his post-op room. Megan held the boots against her chest like an artifact, like a prayer. He told me in recovery. Said if you hadn't been there, he'd be dead. Said you moved like someone who'd done it 1,000 times under fire. Davies paused. Which you had. She didn't speak. Couldn't speak. The boots felt heavier than they should. You took a bullet for him, Davies said quietly. That's not civilian nursing. That's the instinct of someone who's willing to die for her team. You can hide that, Senior Chief. You can wear scrubs and move through the world like you're nobody. But that bullet didn't change anything about who you are. It just finally made the world see it. 6 months later, Mercy General's new trauma wing gleamed under recessed lighting. The waiting area had changed. The protocols had changed. The entire culture around combat casualties had transformed into something deliberate and disciplined. Megan moved through the space like she owned it. Because she did. Her office door had her name on it, Senior Chief Petty Officer Megan O'Brien, Head Trauma Nurse. The worn combat boots stood on a shelf beside a framed photograph, her and Marcus Webb at a veteran's ceremony, his arm around her shoulders, both of them wearing dress uniforms, medals catching light. In the photo, she was smiling. In person, she was teaching a group of new residents how to recognize signs of compartment syndrome before irreversible tissue damage occurred. The difference between a good outcome and amputation is sometimes 90 seconds, she told them, moving with the kind of authority that made everyone in the room stand straighter. In trauma, you don't have time for hesitation. You move. You assess. You decide. She paused. And you own that decision. The residents took notes like they were transcribing scripture. On her way home that evening, Megan passed a strip mall on Military Highway. The signage was new, Hargrove Insurance Solutions. Through the window, she could see him, thin, diminished, sitting at a folding table with a banner advertising term life policies and whole life investment strategies. He was explaining something to a couple who looked politely disinterested. His watch was gone, replaced with a cheap digital that probably cost $40 at a drugstore. Their eyes met through the glass. Hargrove's face went pale. He stood up, knocking his chair backward, his hand moving as if to close the window or hide or simply disappear. Megan simply nodded. One measured acknowledgement. Not forgiveness. Never forgiveness. Just the recognition of a balance achieved, a weight redistributed, a universe momentarily bent back toward justice. She kept walking. The trauma simulation room was packed with new residents, their mannequins arranged like fallen soldiers waiting for treatment. Megan stood in the center, hand steady, voice clear as a command frequency. Your patient is a 34-year-old male, GSW to the abdomen, vitals crashing. What's your first move? A young nurse raised her hand. Massive transfusion protocol. Correct. But you're also assessing for what? Internal bleeding. Organ perforation. In what order? The resident hesitated. Megan touched the small scar visible on her shoulder where the bandage had been removed weeks ago. The bullet hole. The evidence of everything she'd been hiding from. The order depends on where you've been, Megan said quietly. On what you've learned. On whether you trust your instincts or you second-guess them. She gestured toward her office window, where the worn combat boots were visible on their shelf. I spent 8 years trying to forget where I came from. Trying to be somebody smaller. Somebody safer. She looked at each resident in turn. And then a bullet reminded me that the things we run from are often exactly what the world needs us to be. The young nurse who'd asked about transfusion protocol leaned forward. How do you stay so calm under pressure? Megan smiled. Just slightly. Someone once told me that true class is what you do when the lights go out. In trauma medicine, the lights go out every day. You find out who you are in the darkness. She paused, letting the silence settle. And sometimes, you find out you were never really hiding at all. The simulation began. The monitors started beeping. The chaos unfolded in controlled, choreographed urgency. Megan watched from the edge of the room, the phantom pain of her shoulder reminding her she was still standing, still breathing, still here. The woman she'd been in Helmand Province and the woman she'd become in Norfolk were finally occupying the same body, the same space, the same life. No more running. If you know someone whose quiet strength masks extraordinary resilience, whose true value was revealed only when the world finally had no choice but to see it, please share this story. And if you've ever been underestimated, by a boss, by colleagues, by the world, subscribe and let us know your story in the comments. You might just inspire someone else to stop hiding.